Hello. For those of you who like videos, I am doing this for Chapter 11. I'll just pick out the highlights for Chapter 11 and bone health. For you, you could either use this as a review or as an introduction before you read through the slides. So we are doing bone health this week as well as the antioxidant chapter. So the main thing here is we're just looking first of all at the role of the bones. Obviously, we know there's many bones. They're a source of minerals. The main thing we're interested in this chapter is where we get these minerals in our diet and where they go in our body and their function there. Also, it's pretty important that we recognize that these minerals have a lot to do with blood cell formation and also blood levels. The levels of the minerals in our blood are important to maintain a balance of our pH. So the foundation of the actual physiology of the bone, this is just important because it's important to know where these minerals go. So the periosteum, which we don't really talk about, is just the skin, the very, very outside layer of the bone for structure. It gives it stability. The cortical bone is the outer surface, which is compact, pretty compact. So it's right inside the periosteum. And then within that is the trabecular bone, which is it's the open structure that kind of looks like a beehive. And then the bone marrow is where the stem cells are made and also where the blood flow occurs. So it's pretty active. The bones, we think of them as being static, but they're not. There's a lot of activity going on to maintain the health of our bones. The way that their bones grow is there's a couple cells that are particularly important. One we call the osteoclasts and one we call the osteoblasts. So these are two cells that I think for the vocabulary, there's other slides that mention these. There's a lot of vocabulary in this chapter. So these cells, the clasts kind of release acids to break down the bone structure to release the minerals. So if your body is low in minerals, so for instance, if your blood levels for calcium are low, the osteoclasts will crumble. We usually think of clasts, crumble, blasts, build. So those are the two connectors you need to remember. So the clasts will crumble the bone by these lysosomes and acids, which will free up the calcium, the phosphorus, and the magnesium to be used elsewhere in the body. If there's plenty of these minerals already in the blood, or you've just ingested a big meal, then the osteoblasts will build the bone by embedding these minerals in the collagen. Remember, we talked about collagen in the last chapter, and this forms a very, very strong substance called hydroxyapatite, which is the implantation of minerals within the collagen. So you've got this protein collagen, and then you've got minerals embedded in the collagen, which makes it stronger than steel. So that is the formation or the function of how bones look. But then we want to know what affects our bone health. So how do we keep bones strong, or how do we make them strong besides just having milk, calcium in our diet, which we hear about all the time? We need calcium for our bones. There's other things too. For instance, here's a whole list: things that increase and things that decrease our bone mass. So increased bone mass just from exercise. By putting resistance on our bones, using our muscles and tendons to pull against the bone, that builds bone mass. Those with a larger frame size automatically or naturally have a higher bone mass. If you have estrogen, so women that are ovulating and during their years of having a period have a much stronger bone structure than at menopause. After menopause, which is here, there's a lot less estrogen released from the ovaries, which then lowers the bone mass. If you're of African descent, you have a larger frame size, an increased bone mass. And then if you have a diet higher in fruits and vegetables, a vegetarian, the theory is that the alkaline that forms from these fruits and vegetables actually increases bone mass. So in the opposite situation, a decreased bone mass, so that we mentioned the menopause, the acid, so having a high protein diet, high grain, produces more acid, which can lead to lack of bone mass. If you're Asian or Caucasian, you have a lower bone mass just genetically. If you are not exposed to UVB light, because the vitamin D from the sunlight helps absorption of calcium. If you have a high intake of caffeine, high intake of phosphorus and of sodium. So phosphorus is usually one of the most common sources would be sodas, phosphoric acid in soda. So those can all decrease your bone mass. So there's a lot of other things besides just getting milk in your diet that can affect your bone. Here's just a picture of why it's important to exercise, because the skeletal muscle, as I mentioned, pulls against the bone and it allows it to rebuild. It causes an increase in rebuilding. So some of the minerals then, the rest of this chapter just looks at individual minerals and how they affect the bone. So calcium is the one we just mentioned that we all are well aware of. It has a lot of functions in our body besides just the bone. It also functions in maintaining the acid-base balance in our blood. It maintains or is involved in nerve impulses, muscle contractions. It helps with maintaining blood pressure, allowing blood clotting, and it just in the actual cell formation. So it's not just for the bones, which is why it's an important mineral. The added benefits also, it can lower colon cancer, it lowers the risk of kidney stone formation. If you have a good source of calcium in your diet and you are exposed to lead, you'll absorb less lead, and it can lower blood pressure. So having adequate calcium is pretty important all around. And then here's just the RDA. There's different RDAs based on your age. So they've suggested that if you're in 19 to 70, pretty much most adults 1,000 milligrams a day. And then once you're over 50, they suggest a little higher. And then those that are younger and growing quickly, a little higher as well. So those are the situations there. Then we have here just a picture of absorption. So there's not, even if you ingest a certain amount, like the 1,000 milligrams or 800 milligrams a day, the absorption is usually lower in females and higher in males. So it's not even in how it's distributed in your body. So the bioavailability of calcium can change even as you grow. So infants absorb the highest amount of their intake of calcium. Pregnant and breastfeeding mothers, the next highest, adults, and then seniors. Absorption in elderly is lower overall, so that affects obviously their health. So here's other things that affect the absorption. If you have, we just mentioned this, if you have plenty of vitamin D, and also the parathyroid hormone is essential for absorption of calcium. If you have plenty of lactose, that actually helps the calcium absorption. Acidic environment helps absorption. And then just food moving through, as you ingest food, it absorbs, your absorption increases. It's decreased by these chemicals that are naturally in a lot of plants. So tannins, you think in tea, phytic acid, in beans, oxalates, and greens. These can actually deter the calcium absorption. By cooking vegetable greens and vegetables, that helps with the absorption, and adding a little acid to it also can help, like a little vinegar on your greens. Diarrhea will cause a loss of calcium, not having enough vitamin D as you get older, and medications can interfere with absorption. So there's a lot of effects there on how much of the food you actually eat is going to be absorbed. But these are good sources of calcium. Yogurt, we all know that dairy products, cheeses. If you have orange juice with fortification, obviously there's added calcium. Mostly as you see, it's all dairy. And then there's salmon. If you eat the small bones in the salmon, that's a high source of calcium. And most fortified cereals have added nutrients to them. But other than that, these are generally dairy products, except for tofu, which is a bean product. Soy milk, tofu, made from soy milk, are other good sources of calcium. Here's some greens too that we just mentioned. All these greens can be a good source, but they should be cooked and possibly served with some acid ingredient. Here's another idea that when you are eating your foods with calcium, actually some hormones are triggered in your GI tract. So here, this gastrin, we might have talked about this earlier this year. This will trigger the blood calcium to be absorbed and then to actually be stored. Because if you've just eaten, say, an ice cream cone or something with a lot of calcium, there's a high level in your GI tract, so it's immediately sent via the blood to the bones to be stored, and that's when the osteoblasts do their work to actually build the bone. So calcium is going to shuffle back and forth between the blood, GI, and the bones to keep the levels correct. There's a constant movement. So here is the two hormones, or there's like 3. You can count vitamin D as a hormone. It actually is a hormone because the definition for a hormone is something that's produced in one part of your body but functions in another part. So the vitamin D is produced in your skin, but it has multiple functions throughout your body. But PTH is the parathyroid hormone, and calcitonin. These are 2 hormones produced by the pituitary, and they are triggered based on your calcium levels, whether or not they should put away the calcium in the bone or whether they should maintain the calcium in the blood. So calcitonin will lower your calcium blood levels. So this means when there's calcitonin triggered, then it's going to put away, store the extra calcium in the bone. But when PTH is a high level, that means that calcium is being drawn from the bone to the blood to maintain the calcium blood levels. So these hormones are constantly interacting to maintain the blood level of calcium that's essential for our pH. So here, if calcium levels are low, then that's when the parathyroid hormone will be released. And what does it do? It actually stimulates the vitamin D activation, which then causes our body to retain more calcium from our diet, to break down more calcium from our bone, to make sure that we have it in our blood, and to stimulate a more absorption from our intestines. So even as in the same individual, you might have a different level of absorption from different times of the day, depending on your calcium levels. So parathyroid hormone is essential for that maintenance. So that just shows some of the homeostasis of calcium. So one of the other minerals then here is phosphorus. We talked a little bit about that. Where do we get, or what is the function of phosphorus? The function of that is to help be in the hydroxyapatite part of the bone to maintain the strength of the bone. So just calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium, and several other minerals are also there in the bone structure. It's important for ATP. If you recalled, we talked about adenosine triphosphate. So without phosphorus, we can't have an energy source. So it's pretty essential to our body. It's in part of phospholipid membranes. Remember the phospho we talked about, the breakdown from free radicals of the cell membrane, the phospholipid membrane structure. So that's important. And it also has to do with the pH and DNA, RNA. So there's multiple functions for these minerals, not just for bone health. Some of the food sources of phosphorus, in case you're wondering, are, again, dairy, meats, breads, nuts. It's pretty widely found in our foods. It's not something we tend to be worried about lack of in our diet. So then vitamin D will be another vitamin. This is another vitamin, not a mineral, that has these other names: calciferol, calcitriol. You might hear these other names. This is another essential vitamin for our absorption of calcium, as we just mentioned. Another one will be magnesium. When we go to, here's magnesium. Without enough magnesium, we have something called hypomagnesemia, which can result in low blood calcium. It can cause osteoporosis. So without having a balance of all of these minerals, we could have a problem with our overall bone health, which I'm sure you've heard about, which is osteoporosis. And this is the weakening of here's a good picture, a weakening of the trabecular bone in the very center here, where it becomes like a beehive already, but then you see here it's broken down so that's even less structurally sound. So that's the whole idea, is preventing the loss of too many minerals in our bones so that we have the strength. And as we get older, this is kind of what happens. The normal spine, and as we get older, when things combine and shrink and condense, we have what's called kyphosis, which is just a crushed vertebrae. So we're trying to prevent this as we grow older. And one way to measure it is you can go ahead and get a DEXA scan, and that way you can determine the level of your bone density. So enjoy this chapter. It's interesting. There's one set of questions that follow it, and then there's a quiz. Thank you very much.